Hello, so in this tutorial we will go through a more or less three-step process in order to set up our render, tune our particles, and render out our sequence. The first thing we'll need to do is to set our project, similar to the process with Maya. We just want to get to the whatever folder you have, wherever it is, to make sure that all our scenes and files end up in their correct spots. Then we'll open up the file we'll need. In this case, I have my part 1. I made a part 2, but that was to make sure everything would work. Except, once it's all set up, we will have our scene available to us to see. And the first step will be to make a camera. And so in order to do this, there's a couple different ways, but the way we're going to do it today is we're going to go up to the top here on this taskbar here that's with the camera. And we're going to hit Control and hit the camera button or press Control and hold and hit the camera button. That will give us this camera scene in our scene viewer, and you can see it has this kind of resolution gate already applied to it, and you can see kind of where it is in space and time. That's all great, but if we were to try to move around this camera with this scene in place, it would break that connection and we wouldn't see into the camera anymore. We can just see out and around. We can move this camera around with the different manipulators here, but what we really want to do is be able to kind of do a slow pan around our particles here, and the easiest way to do that is actually to take a null object and just hook it in to the camera. This is going to act, and you can see that the null was centered at the center of the world space, so we can just easily use it to pivot around now. This is a similar idea to using groups in Maya to offset the pivot point of whatever object or camera that you need to manipulate from. And if you wanted to have a camera view, if we went into our camera, where is it? Nope, that's not it. Here it is. If you wanted to look through this camera and be able to move around without breaking the perspective of that camera, you can go down here to the tie view to camera light, and then you can move the camera around and it will stay attached. And then if you wanted to, you can just break that and then it will no longer be attached. So if we go, but for now we want it to kind of, let's start at the beginning of our timeline and kind of get an idea of what this camera view is looking like. Okay, so that's probably going to be, what's it going to look like? Okay, that looks okay. And so after that, we will start off by keying this frame here on this time slider. We will go back to the beginning to start at the start of our animation. We can key a frame by Alt left mousing over, hitting the Alt button and the left mouse button. That will turn the different selection green, which will show you that it's been keyed. And then we can go to the end of our timeline here at 120 frames, and then Alt left click to key again, and you can move the camera around. And if we hit play, you can see that the camera moves around, pans around the animation, and we should be able to see, tie the camera to the camera view, what that looks like. Okay, that sets up our camera, and so after that we will set up our material that will be rendered out when we render this whole sequence out. I'm gonna break that connection and go back to perspective view. Okay. So we'll go over to this material with palettes tab, and it will look something like this. You will want to go to the bottom here, all the way to the bottom where it says utility with this little orange stripy box, and take this constant and drag and drop it into this little window over here onto this side. And we'll go. You can go into your material and like rename it. We can name it like Part Matte, and that it will change its name. And that is the way that will be. You can see it over here in this. You can see that it changed the context of our editor right here to matte. And what we were in the object one before, if you click it, you can go back to that one. For right now, we want to go over to the outputs context, and in here we will set up the renderer that we will eventually render out to. So we need to hit the tab button, and you can start typing in mantra. We will be using this node here to render out from. We want to make sure it's the camera we are using is what we want to render from is the one that is hooked up. In this case, it is. It already did that. We don't have to worry about that. At least for me. If you named your camera something different, or you have a different camera in the screen, you just select them from this little menu here, this button here. But mine is the camera 1, and I only have one camera in the scene. And you can view the render from this little button down here. And it will show you a rendered scene of blackness. But for now, we will be using the render view over here in the tabs of the main Houdini window. Alrighty, so we can see what that would sort of look like. I'm gonna pause that render. Just stop that render, so it's just not going on in the background. Alright, so from here we're going to go back to our object view to see our beautiful particles and start kind of fine-tuning those to get more of an animation we want. Right now they just kind of out here sort of doing something, but we want them to be a little different. We want them to be have a little bit more randomness in a specific direction and change sizes and things like that. So in order to do that, we're going to go into our particle, and after this pop network here, we're going to add another point pop. We can hook those in together, and if you go into it, you'll see the incoming attributes in here onto the left and the outputs on the right. But we don't want any of these outputs at the moment. We want a separate output for the scale of the particles, so we'll have to make our own attribute for that. So if we hit tab, we can make a bind export node, which will give us the ability to export a different parameter. And we'll go ahead and name this P scale, and we need to input it into we need to make a parameter to be able to change the size of our particles. So we'll just create one of those here too. We'll name it global scale and give it a nice name. and then we'll hook the global scale into the inputs. And if we go up one level, you can see we now have a global scale attribute here, and it slides from 0 to 1. I'm actually going to change that because this scale value is going to be fairly small. Our float range is going to be from 0 to 0.01. That's all fine and good, but as you can see, it doesn't really do much, but that's because it's not really attached to anything. Oh. So we're going to fix that by hooking in some different attributes here. So we're going to try to make these particles kind of start out big, and then as they're dying, they slowly fade away, getting smaller and smaller. So some of the attributes that we'll be needing are these age and life attributes. So if we hit tab and create a divide node, we can hook in our age and life attributes into that first divide node. Then we can go ahead and blend these two parameters, or these two nodes together with a multiply node. We can put the divide into the first input and the global scale into the second, and then the product into the input of the p-scale bind node. After we do all that, if we go over here to our render view and hit render, we should be able to see some thing. Or not. That's because our p-scale, our global scale value is set to 0. Let's give it some values now. And see if that does anything. So, as you can see, there's some values here. There's some particles here, and one very large particle. So let's average out that huge particle with a clamp node. And this will just make it so that there's no crazy, I'm going to pause that for a second, crazy huge values intermixed with our small values. So we'll just set that in between our divide and multiply node and see how that does. And that kind of helps get rid of that one giant particle. After that, it's hard to tell, but these are all, they're all being created small and getting bigger with age. So we want the exact opposite. We want, we want them to be as big as they're going to be, and then kind of slowly get smaller as they get older. So in order to do that, we need to make a complement node, which will, our values will start out large and get smaller over time before dying, and we'll input that into here, complement, between the clamp and the multiply. Alrighty, after that, that still sets all these values at a very constant rate. All the particles are very uniform still. So let's introduce some randomness into the equation. So we'll make a random node and set it to this ID attribute here. I'm going to pause this render here. And then put the randomness output into this input 3 on the multiply node. Pause. And because our particles are all random, there's a random distribution of big ones and small ones, but with particles it's better to have more smaller particles and fewer larger particles to get a better result as far as a particle-y look. So let's fix that by making a power node and putting it between the random and the multiply nodes. So, and in this exponents category, we'll just set this to like 3. And that will render it, test render, and see how that's looking. Alright, that helps us get smaller particles, but now you can see we kind of lost some particles because they've gotten too small. So in order to keep that from happening, we'll add a constant node to just help, not a constant, an add constant, to help keep some of those from getting too small. And we'll input that between the power and multiply nodes here, like that. And let's render it again. And that brought a lot of our particles back into a better range for our viewing pleasure. Now that we have all this set up, let's go ahead and add some color to the particles. So in here we're going to make a ramp parameter. And it has a slider that you can see that with a gradient on it. We will take our input from our clamp into the ramp like that, and we will take the ramp from our ramp into our color of our output. And then we'll go up to our particle layer, and you can see that we've added this attribute here for our ramp. And if we hit render, you'll notice that it's not going to be very interesting because it's black and white. So you can go in here and change the colors to whatever suits your fancy. And you can kind of tell that there's a little disparity between like the red ones and the blue ones. So there's a lot more red here than blue. So you can just go in here and move these around to kind of get a better idea of which... Oh, I did not like that at all. Okay, whatever. That was weird. You can kind of get a better idea of the scale of which your particles are being rendered at by how far away they are. You can add more of these things and give them other colors too. And you can kind of actually use these to help you figure out how many of each particle size you have, because these are all, or the life they have actually. We hook these up in a way that would be affected by their lifespan. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. And so if we go back into our point VOP, between our ramp and our geometry output, if we want these to look a little bit more glowy, like they're more like a particle glowing and everything, we can go in here and make a multiply constant node and then put it between these two, and that just gives them a little bit more, makes them pop just a little bit more. And that's the final stage of our particle development and tunings. So we can now render this out. So if we go back to our pause, if we go back to our, I believe it's, nope, it's not that far into there. It's our pop network, our source. You can change the number of points you have. Here I have 10,000. You can up that value. Discretion is advised when using a lot of values. Your computer may crash. Set that to a number that you're happy with. And the Houdini has this thing called takes, similar to like different takes if you were working on a film, like a film take. And you can access that by hitting this new take button. It will take you to a new tab for the different takes. And by default, everything is kind of grayed out. You can't see anything. So if we go in here into our PopNet, there we go. You can see all of these are grayed out. But if you wanted to like change the rate or something, you can include it in take, and then you can go ahead and slide this a lot more. I'll pause that again, to whatever crazy number you want, and it's saved into this one take. But you have also your main take where it hasn't been overwritten. So in that way you can kind of change a few of the different attributes to get you something that looks a little different, and kind of choose between which ones you think are looking better, without changing like the main settings you have in your main scene. So I've added some more points, and I'll go in here and change the global scale smaller as well to kind of get me a value that's a little smaller, because I have so many of them. They can be a little smaller now, and we'll see how that looks and if my computer will hold up. Yeah, so we're getting a very particle-y look going on here, and from here I will go into my out context where we created our mantra node, and in here, I'm actually going to go back to my main. I'm going to pause this and go back to our main take so that we can easily fiddle with our settings here. So with this mantra tab selected, you will see your camera, and we want to render more than just one frame. So up here where it says valid frame range, we will change it from render current frame to render frame range, and then set that to whatever range you have. I have from 1 to 120, and because that's what I put down here on my time slider. And I will render with take. This render with take function here, I will use my take 1 so that it will take it from my take 1 instead of my main, because I've tweaked it to appear a certain way from my take 1. And if I tab over to this rendering tab, you will see where it says allow for motion blur. That will just kind of give me a better result when the particles are moving around real quick, kind of more accurate to real life, or at least to a movie life, I guess I should say. And another thing is that when you go to like your object view, you'll see these different attributes. All these things are like visible and stuff. And if you just want to make sure that Mantra is only going to render out the things that you want it to render out, you can go over to the Objects tab here, and instead of having this star next to the objects, you can delete that and force objects to only appear, to only show what you want it to show. And for us, that's going to be mine's called particle. That's what I want to show. So accept that into the force objects category. And that should be more or less it. The only other thing that we'll have to make sure to do, instead of rendering from this button here, we have to render to disk, because that way it will save the files onto the disk, onto your hard drive disk, instead of just having them appear in a window. So if we hit that, you'll see the frame count and this rendering image, and the time elapsed, and we'll be sitting here for a little while it works and does its thing. Okay, the render finally finished up, and it took about 30 minutes on my home machine, but your mileage will vary. And I don't have Nuke, so I just put it into Photoshop and compiled all the EXRs there, and this is the results that we got. Yours will look different depending on the settings that you input and the look you're going for exactly, but I think it looks pretty good. This one's a little bit low quality, but you know, you can change that in your settings if you want to. And there you go. I'll have kind of a list of the steps I took to get to this final product in the description below, and good luck on all your Houdini adventures.